In every family, there's a story they tell themselves, a script. And in that script, everyone gets a role. You've got the hero, the caretaker, the peacemaker, and you almost always have the villain, the scapegoat, the one who gets to wear the crazy hat so everyone else can feel sane. I've seen it 1,000 times. A family walks onto my stage broken and at war, and one person comes with a label already printed on their forehead, "I'm the problem." And the rest of the family nods in agreement. But my job isn't to read the labels. My job is to read what's underneath, to peel back the layers of blame and resentment and find the truth of the system, not just the story they've all agreed to tell. This particular story started, as so many do, with a desperate phone call. It was a woman named Sarah. She was articulate, composed, sounded completely reasonable. She told my producers about her younger sister, Emily. According to Sarah, Emily was a walking disaster. Unstable, dramatic, toxic, a black hole of need who sucked the life out of every family gathering. She said Emily picked fights, created chaos, and was making their aging mother sick with worry. The narrative was clean, simple, and powerful. Sarah was a responsible, long-suffering sister trying to hold the family together, while Emily was the emotional grenade constantly threatening to blow it all up. Sarah's goal, she said, was to get her sister help to have an intervention on my stage because she had exhausted all other options. Now, when I hear a story that's too neat, my antenna go up. Human beings are messy. Family dynamics are messy. When one person is painted as the sole source of all trouble, I start looking for the artist. I start wondering who's holding the paintbrush. I agreed to have them on the show, but I told my team to dig deep. I didn't just want to hear Sarah's side, and I knew Emily's side would be colored by years of being told she was the problem. I wanted to see the whole picture. The home videos, the text messages, the emails. I wanted to talk to aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone who had a view from outside the bunker. When I first reviewed the pre-interview tapes, the dynamic was exactly as Sarah had described it on the surface. Sarah sat straight back speaking in calm, measured tones about Emily's latest episode. She had a list, a literal, itemized list of Emily's transgressions. The time she'd made a scene at Thanksgiving, the time she'd hung up on their mother, the time she'd accused Sarah of being controlling. It was a prosecutor's opening statement. Then I watched Emily's tape, and she was the polar opposite. She was a bundle of raw nerves, emotional, sometimes crying, sometimes angry. She'd start to tell a story, get tangled up in the details, and lose her train of thought. She'd say things like, "She's twisting it, that's not how it happened," but her defense was disorganized, it was chaotic. To the untrained eye, she looked exactly like the unstable person Sarah had described. She looked guilty. But I wasn't looking at the performance, I was looking at the pain. I saw a woman who had been gaslit for so long, she was starting to doubt her own reality. She was drowning, and every time she flailed her arms to try and save herself, her sister pointed and shouted, "See, look how she's flailing, she's crazy." The central problem, as I saw it, wasn't Emily's behavior, that was a symptom. The problem was the family's unspoken agreement to make Emily the designated patient. She was the emotional dumping ground for the entire family system. Anything that went wrong, any uncomfortable feelings, any tension, it all got projected onto Emily. It was easier to have one problem child than to admit that the whole system was broken. Sarah, in her role as the good sister, had the most to lose if that system ever got challenged. Her identity was built on being the opposite of Emily, the sane one, the competent one, the one who had it all together. And for her to maintain that role, she needed Emily to stay in hers. It was a perfect and perfectly destructive symbiosis. They were locked in a dance, and the music had been playing since they were children. My job was to walk onto that stage and stop the music. You don't get to be 35 and still locked in a childhood battle by accident. These roles, the good sister and the bad sister, they were forged in the fire of their family home. My team and I started piecing together the history, and a picture emerged that was as tragic as it was predictable. The father was a ghost in his own house. Not abusive, not a drunk, just absent, emotionally checked out. He worked long hours, and when he was home, he was behind a newspaper or in front of a television. The emotional thermostat of the house was set and controlled by the mother, and she was a woman wound tight with anxiety. Everything had to be just so. The house had to be perfect. The children had to be perfect. Any disruption to the calm surface was a threat. So what happens in a home like that? The children learn to adapt. Sarah, being the older one, figured it out quickly. The way to get love, or at least to avoid disapproval, was to be a miniature adult. She learned to read her mother's moods, to anticipate her needs, to be quiet, to be helpful, to get straight A's. She became her mother's little lieutenant, a partner in the desperate campaign to keep everything looking perfect. She got praise for being so mature for her age. What a terrible burden to put on a child. We're not supposed to be mature for our age. We're supposed to be our age. Sarah wasn't allowed to be a messy kid, so she buried her own needs, her own fears, her own anger deep, deep down. Then came Emily. By the time she arrived, the family script was already written. Sarah was the good one. The parents were the fragile ones. There was no room for another perfect child. And Emily was a different kid altogether. She was sensitive, expressive, what some would call a spirited child. She felt things deeply. When there was tension in the house, she didn't know how to suppress it like Sarah did. She acted it out. She cried. She had tantrums. She asked awkward questions. She was the family's emotional canary in the coal mine. When the air got toxic, she was the first one to show symptoms. But instead of the parents looking at the environment and asking, what's making our child act this way, they looked at Emily and said, what's wrong with you? Her feelings weren't seen as a valid response to a tense environment. They were seen as the source of the tension. She was shamed for her emotions. Why are you so dramatic? You're upsetting your mother. Why can't you be more like your sister? Sarah, in turn, was rewarded for controlling Emily. Thank you for calming your sister down, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you. And right there, the dynamic was cemented. Sarah's identity became tied to managing her out-of-control sister. Emily's identity became the one who needs managing. I saw it in the old home videos my team dug up. A birthday party. 7-year-old Sarah is standing perfectly still by the cake, smiling for the camera. 4-year-old Emily is running around excited and accidentally knocks over a cup of juice. The camera shakes, you hear the mother gasp, and then you hear her sharp voice off screen. Emily, for heaven's sake, look what you did. You've ruined it. Then you hear Sarah's little voice. It's okay, Mommy, I'll clean it up. The camera pans back to show Sarah dutifully wiping the spill with a napkin while Emily stands in the corner crying. It was all there in that 30-second clip. The spill wasn't the problem. The reaction was the problem. Emily learned that her natural childlike impulses were destructive. Sarah learned that her value came from cleaning up her sister's messes. Fast forward 25 years and they're playing the exact same roles. Sarah is still the hyper-competent manager and Emily is still the one spilling the juice. The stage is just bigger. Now, it's not about a birthday party. It's about decisions for their aging mother, holiday plans, finances. Sarah would create these intricate, detailed plans for everything designed to maintain that same fragile sense of control she learned as a child. But her plans left no room for human emotion, no room for dissent. When Emily would inevitably have a different opinion or an emotional reaction, I don't think we should sell Mom's house, it would break her heart, or I feel like you're not listening to me, Sarah didn't hear a valid perspective. She heard the 4-year-old spilling the juice. She heard chaos. She heard a threat to the perfect order she needed to feel safe. And she would react just as her mother did by labeling Emily as the problem. You're being irrational. You're too emotional. You're making things difficult for everyone. It was a devastatingly effective way to shut her sister down, to invalidate her feelings, and to reassert her own control. And after a lifetime of this, Emily had started to believe it herself. So you take that childhood dynamic, that fragile, carefully constructed system, and you flash forward 2 decades. What happens? Life happens. And life has a way of stress testing these family systems until they crack. The catalyst in this case was their mother's health. She had a series of small strokes, nothing catastrophic at first, but it was the beginning of a slow, undeniable decline. And this is where the roles they had practiced for a lifetime went into overdrive. Sarah, true to form, stepped into the role of crisis manager. She put on a hard hat and pulled out a clipboard. She organized doctor's appointments, researched nursing homes, and created spreadsheets tracking medications and finances. On the surface, this was admirable. She was being a responsible daughter. But underneath it was the 7-year-old girl all over again, desperately trying to control a situation that was by its very nature uncontrollable. Death and decline don't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. Sarah wasn't just managing logistics, she was managing her own terror. The terror of losing her mother, the terror of her carefully ordered world falling apart. And her primary strategy for managing that terror was to manage everyone and everything around her. Emily's reaction was completely different. She wasn't thinking about spreadsheets, she was feeling the grief. She saw her mother fading, and it broke her heart. She wanted to sit with her mom, hold her hand, look through old photo albums, and talk about memories. She was trying to process the emotional reality of what was happening. But in this family's twisted system, Sarah's practical, detached approach was labeled strong, and Emily's emotional response was labeled weak and unhelpful. The escalation began in the doctor's office. Sarah would arrive with a binder full of questions for the doctor about medication, side effects, and long-term prognoses. Emily would be trying to comfort their mother, asking things like, "Mom, are you scared?" or telling the doctor she seems so sad lately. Sarah saw this as a distraction. She'd interrupt saying, "Emily, that's not relevant right now." Doctor back to the dosage levels. She would later recount these moments to other family members and to my producers as evidence of Emily's instability. She was falling apart in the middle of the neurologist's office, she'd say. I had to handle everything. She wasn't lying, she was just telling her version of the truth. In her world, having feelings in a crisis was falling apart. She had never been allowed to do it, so she couldn't tolerate it in her sister. The conflict reached a boiling point over the issue of the family home. With the mounting medical bills and the reality that their mother would never live there independently again, Sarah made the executive decision that they needed to sell it. She researched real estate agents, got appraisals, and drew up a timeline. She presented it to Emily not as a discussion, but as a concluded fact, a business plan. For Emily, this was like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of their entire lives, their memories, the last tangible piece of their family as it once was. She saw the sale as a final heartbreaking admission of defeat. She resisted. She said it was too soon, that it would devastate their mother. She pleaded with Sarah to slow down to think about the emotional impact. This was the ultimate act of spilling the juice. Sarah couldn't see Emily's grief. All she saw was insubordination. She saw her sister actively sabotaging her well-laid plans. The arguments became vicious. The text and emails which I reviewed were brutal. Sarah would write long, condescending messages detailing why Emily's position was irrational and emotionally driven, as if that were a character flaw. Emily would respond with raw, desperate messages. You don't care about anyone's feelings but your own, and this is Mom's house, not your business. Each of Emily's emotional pleas was logged by Sarah as another piece of evidence for the prosecution. The blame shifting was masterful. The family's collective grief and stress over the mother's illness was a heavy weight. But instead of the family sharing that weight, Sarah had successfully managed to hang it all around Emily's neck. It wasn't the situation that was sad and stressful. It was Emily who was making it sad and stressful. The final straw came when Sarah tried to get Emily to sign some preliminary paperwork with a realtor. Emily refused. She stood her ground. In front of their mother, a huge argument erupted. Emily was in tears, yelling that Sarah was a bully. Sarah remained icily calm and said, "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You are out of control and you are hurting our mother. You need help. That's when she called my show. She wasn't coming for a negotiation. She was coming to have me, doctor. Phil co-signed her diagnosis of her sister to declare Emily mentally unfit so she could get on with her plan. She was bringing her sister to me to be fixed, never once imagining that the entire family machine was broken. The day of the show, the tension backstage was thick enough to cut with a knife. You could feel it. Sarah was composed, sitting upright in her chair in the green room, reviewing her notes. Yes, she had notes. A list of grievances, talking points. She was prepped like she was going into a corporate negotiation. She was in her comfort zone, control logic order. Emily was in the room down the hall and you could hear her. Not shouting, but you could hear the nervous energy. She was pacing, talking to her husband on the phone, her voice high and strained. She was an open wound and she was about to be put on display. When I bring a family out on stage, I watch everything. I watch how they walk, how they sit, who looks at whom, who avoids eye contact. It's a silent conversation that tells you more than the first 10 minutes of dialogue ever will. Sarah walked out first with a confident, purposeful stride. She sat down, crossed her legs, and looked directly at me. Her expression was a mixture of righteousness and concern. It said, I'm the reasonable one here. Help me. Emily followed a few steps behind. She walked hesitantly, almost like she was being led to an execution. She sat on the edge of the couch, perched and ready for flight. She wouldn't look at me. She wouldn't look at her sister. She stared at her hands, which were twisting a shredded piece of tissue in her lap. The audience saw exactly what Sarah wanted them to see, a calm, stable woman and her distraught, unstable sister. The narrative was playing out visually before anyone had even said a word. I started with Sarah. I always let the accuser lay out their case. It's important. You have to give them the space to feel heard. I let her go through her list. I let her describe the scenes at the hospital, the arguments over the house, the dramatic phone calls. She was articulate and her points seemed compelling. I'm just trying to be practical, Dr. Phil, she said, her voice dripping with frustrated sincerity. Someone has to be the adult here. While I'm trying to make sure our mother is cared for, Emily is having emotional meltdowns. I listened, I nodded, and then I turned to Emily. Emily, I said, my voice calm and even. You hear all that? Your sister says you're falling apart, that you're making a difficult situation impossible. What's your side of this story? She took a shaky breath. That's not how it is. She stammered the words, tumbling out in a rush. She doesn't listen. She decides how everything is going to be, and if I have a different feeling, if I disagree, then I'm the crazy one. She says, I'm having a meltdown, but I'm just sad. Our mother is dying. Aren't we allowed to be sad? Her voice cracked on the last word and the tears she'd been holding back started to fall. And right on cue, Sarah jumped in. See, this is what I'm talking about, Dr. Phil. This is what I have to deal with. We can't have a rational conversation because she just cries. That was it. That was the moment, the pivot point. I held up my hand to stop Sarah. Hold on a minute, I said, turning my full attention to her. The confrontation had to start with her. She was the gatekeeper of this narrative. Let me ask you a question, Sarah. Your mother is sick. You're facing the reality of losing a parent. You're dealing with doctors and finances and making life-altering decisions. You're telling me you haven't shed a single tear through all of this. She was taken aback. Of course this is difficult for me, she said, her posture stiffening, but I have to be strong. I can't afford to fall apart. Who says crying is falling apart? I asked directly. Who taught you that? Who taught you that feelings are a liability in a crisis? Because I'll tell you something. They're not a liability. They're a barometer. They're a compass. They tell you what's really going on. Your sister is crying because she's losing her mother. That seems like a pretty healthy, normal reaction to me. The question I have is, what are you doing with your sadness, with your fear? Where is it all going? The audience was silent. Sarah stared at me, her mouth slightly open. This was not in her script. I wasn't co-signing her diagnosis. I was turning the camera around and pointing it directly at her. She tried to deflect. This isn't about me. This is about Emily's behavior. No, this is about a family system, I countered, leaning forward. And you are 50% of the sister part of that system. You've come here and painted a portrait of your sister as a dysfunctional, emotional wreck. But what I see is one sister who is overexpressing the family's pain and another who is suppressing it. Emily is acting out all the grief and fear that you refuse to feel. She's become the emotional container for the whole family, and you're punishing her for it. You're not mad at her because she's emotional. You're mad at her because her emotions remind you of the ones you've locked away in your own basement. This was the core of it. The psychological breakthrough isn't always a flood of tears. Sometimes it's a deafening silence. The silence of a carefully constructed reality beginning to crumble. For the first time, Sarah didn't have a quick, logical answer. She just looked at me, a flicker of something, confusion, fear, maybe even a hint of recognition in her eyes. She had spent her entire life believing she was the healthy one, the strong one. I had just suggested that her strength was actually a form of profound emotional disability, that her greatest asset was actually her biggest handicap. The foundation of her identity had just been hit with a sledgehammer. And in the silence that followed, Emily, for the first time that day, stopped crying, looked up, and watched her sister, waiting to see what she would do. That moment of silence on stage was critical. It was a crossroads. In these situations, a person can go one of two ways. They can double down, get defensive, and fight even harder to protect their narrative. Or they can allow a crack to form in the armor, just enough for a little bit of truth to seep in. For a long moment, I wasn't sure which way Sarah would go. Her jaw was tight, her hands clenched in her lap. The prosecutor was gearing up for a rebuttal. I am not emotionally disabled, she said, her voice low and tight. I am functional. I get things done. While Emily is having panic attacks, I am the one making the hard calls. That is not a disability. That's called being a grown-up. It was the response I expected. The defensive wall went right back up. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook. Being a grown-up also means having the courage to be vulnerable. I said, keeping my tone steady. It means being able to feel your own pain without projecting it onto somebody else. Let me show you something. This is when I turned to the video screen. My team had put together a clip from the pre-interview I had done with her mother. She was in her assisted living facility, frail but lucid. I had asked her a simple question. What do you want for your daughters? The old woman's face filled the screen. Her eyes were watery. I worry about them, she said, her voice thin. Sarah, she's always been such a good girl, so responsible. She takes care of everything, but I feel like I don't. I don't really know her. She never lets me see if she's hurting. Her gaze shifted away from the camera. And Emily, oh my Emily, she has such a big heart. She feels everything so deeply, I think. I think I leaned on her for that. When I was sad, she was sad with me. It wasn't fair. I made Sarah the grown-up, and I made Emily my little emotional twin. I think I broke them both in different ways. The impact in the studio was immediate and profound. It was a confession and an absolution all at once. It came from the one person whose approval they had both been fighting for their entire lives. Emily let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. She wasn't just crying for her mother's decline anymore. She was crying for the little girl who was made to feel that her big feelings were a burden. But my eyes were on Sarah. Her mask of composure was gone, utterly gone. Her face had crumpled. Silent tears were streaming down her cheeks, not the performative tears of a victim, but the wrenching, involuntary tears of someone whose soul had just been cracked open. The little girl who was never allowed to cry, the one who had to be strong for mommy, was finally being given permission. Decades of suppressed grief, anger, and fear came flooding to the surface. She wasn't the competent manager anymore. She was just a daughter who was losing her mom and didn't know how to handle it. I let the moment breathe. There was nothing I could say that would be more powerful than that truth hanging in the air. After a minute, I spoke softly. Sarah, I said, what you're feeling right now, that's not weakness. That's strength. That's the beginning of honesty. For your entire life, you've been carrying the burden of being the strong one, and Emily has been carrying the burden of being the emotional one. But it was never true. You were both just kids trying to survive in a system that didn't allow you to be whole. You were both assigned a role, and you've been playing it so long you forgot you're not the role, you're the person underneath. I turned to Emily. And Emily, you have got to stop accepting the label they've put on you. Your sensitivity is not a pathology, it's a gift. Your ability to feel is not a weakness, it's your superpower. But you've been letting them use it against you. Every time you get emotional and they call you crazy, you start to believe it, which makes you more emotional, and the cycle continues. You have to learn to own your feelings without apology and without needing their validation. I then looked back and forth between them. The two of you have been at war, but you've been fighting the wrong enemy. Your enemy isn't each other. It's the script. It's the roles you were assigned 40 years ago. You can keep playing those roles until the curtain falls, or you can decide right here today to walk off the stage and start writing a new script for yourselves. It was a raw, unfiltered moment. The breakthrough wasn't a neat, tidy resolution. It was messy and painful, as real change always is. Sarah couldn't even speak. She was still crying, trying to process a lifetime of emotional truth that had just hit her like a tidal wave. Emily, seeing her sister's raw vulnerability for the first time, did something that wasn't in the old script. She didn't lash out. She didn't say, "I told you so." She reached across the space between them on the couch, tentatively at first, and put her hand on her sister's arm. It was a simple, profound gesture of connection, the first crack of light in a long, dark tunnel. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, there was a possibility of a ceasefire. Now, the outcome of a show like this is never determined by what happens under the hot lights of the stage. The real work starts the moment the cameras turn off. The breakthrough you see on television, that's just cracking the door open. The real test is whether the guests have the courage to walk through it and keep walking when they get back to their real lives. You can't undo a lifetime of programming in a single hour. Change is a process, not an event. And for Sarah and Emily, the path forward was going to be anything but simple. I provided them with resources, of course, therapists who specialized in family systems, counselors who could help them navigate their mother's end of life, care together, not as adversaries. But I've learned you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. The choice was ultimately theirs. In the weeks and months that followed, my team kept in touch with them. The initial reports were cautiously optimistic, which is about the best you can hope for. The dynamic had shifted. Sarah, having had her emotional armor pierced, couldn't quite put it back on the same way. The conversation on my stage had given her a new lens through which to see herself and her sister. She told my producer that she'd gone home and cried for 3 days straight. It was an emotional dam breaking. She was grieving not just for the impending loss of her mother, but for the loss of her own childhood, for the emotional straitjacket she had worn for 40 years. She started seeing a therapist, someone to help her unpack all that suppressed emotion. It was difficult for her. Her default setting was to analyze and fix, and you can't analyze your way out of grief. You have to feel it. She had to learn a whole new language, the language of vulnerability, and she was clumsy with it at first. She would call Emily intending to have a more open conversation, but would slip back into her old manager role. The difference was now she could sometimes catch herself. "I'm doing it again, aren't I?" she'd say to Emily. "I'm trying to manage you." That self-awareness was a huge step. Emily, for her part, was working on building her own sense of self-worth, independent of her sister's approval or disapproval. Her breakthrough was realizing that she didn't have to be a victim of Sarah's narrative. The moment on stage when she reached out to her sister wasn't about fixing Sarah. It was about Emily choosing to act from a place of compassion rather than a place of reactivity. She was learning to set boundaries. The next time Sarah presented a unilateral plan about their mother's care, instead of exploding or dissolving into tears, Emily learned to say calmly and firmly, "I hear your opinion, Sarah, and I appreciate the research you've done. But I am an equal partner in this, and we will make a decision together. Let's set aside a time to talk when we can both be heard." This new dynamic was tested constantly. The sale of the house was still a major point of contention, but the nature of their conflict changed. It was no longer a personal attack where Sarah called Emily irrational and Emily called Sarah a bully. Instead, it became a slow, painful negotiation between two people with different but equally valid ways of processing a loss. Sarah's priority was financial security for their mother's future care. Emily's was honoring their mother's emotional attachment to the home. They eventually reached a compromise. They would rent out the house for a year, generating income for their mother's care, while giving them all more time to say goodbye to the physical space. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a solution they reached together. It was a landmark victory for their relationship. The outcome wasn't a Hollywood ending where they suddenly became best friends who braided each other's hair. The scars were too deep for that. There were setbacks. There were old arguments that flared up, old wounds that got poked. Their mother passed away about 8 months after the show, and her death plunged them back into a period of intense grief and stress that tested all their new skill. Sarah, under pressure, had moments where she reverted to being the cold, efficient planner. Emily had moments where her grief felt overwhelming and she lashed out in pain. But the fundamental structure had been altered. They could no longer retreat fully into their old roles because they had both seen what was behind the curtain. They knew the script was a fiction. They had a shared language, now concepts like family systems, assigned roles, and projected grief. They could use these terms to de-escalate a fight. One of them could say, "I think we're falling into the old script," and it would be enough to make them both pause and take a breath. The last I heard, they were sorting through their mother's belongings in the old house, a task that would have been a powder keg a year earlier. It was still sad and difficult, but they were doing it side by side. They would argue over who got to keep a particular piece of furniture, but they would also share stories and memories sparked by old photographs. They would cry sometimes separately, sometimes together. They were learning clumsily and imperfectly how to be sisters without the suffocating roles they had been forced to play. The outcome wasn't a perfect resolution, but a real one. It was the messy, painful, beautiful, and ongoing work of breaking a cycle. And in the world of human dynamics, that's about as good a victory as you can get. They didn't fix each other. They started to heal themselves, and in doing so, they created the space to finally truly see each other.